Good afternoon. I'm Michael Kessler, Executive Director of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and a professor in the Government Department and the Law Center. On behalf of my colleagues at the Berkeley Center, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this conference, Religion and Human Rights, from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to Dignitatis Humanae, featuring, as well, the 2024 Berkeley Center Lecture, which will be given by Kathleen Keaveney. This conference commemorates the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, almost to the 75th anniversary, and the 60th anniversary of the Patrick F. Healy Conference, which was called Freedom and Man, held at Georgetown on December 2nd, 1964. The conference Freedom and Man took place in commemoration of the 175th anniversary of the founding of Georgetown University. Among those participating were prominent Catholic theologians, including the Reverend John Courtney Murray, the Reverend Karl Rahner, the Reverend Yves Calvez, and Hans Kung, and the Lebanese Orthodox Christian theologian Charles Malik, who was a member of the UDHR drafting committee. The Georgetown Conference was attended by over 5,000 people and had to be held in McDonough Gymnasium. We will maybe approach some fraction of that attendance today. The proceedings were published in a volume called Freedom and Man, edited by John Courtney Murray in 1965, which had a wide impact on the discussions of religious freedom and rights at the Second Vatican Council, including the drafting of Dignitatis Humanae. To open the conference, we've invited our colleague Peter Petkoff to provide a historical overview of the 1964 conference and some framing remarks about the themes that emerged. Peter Petkoff is a tutorial law fellow and director of the Religion, Law, and International Relations Program, a collaborative international research network at Regent's Park College, Oxford University. He's also the managing editor of the Oxford Journal of Law and Religion. Along with Jose Casanova, David Hollenbach, and myself, Peter is the primary initiator of this conference, having suggested the idea in an email now 2 years old, and some planning sessions, among other things, which we worked together to find this date and this time for this important topic. Peter, we're delighted to invite you to start us off. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is very unusual to celebrate anniversaries of conferences, particularly conferences which do not produce scholarly volumes with critical apparatus and have a research impact as such. And this volume is more of a record of the conference, series of homilies, let's put it that way, rather than scholarly papers. Hans Kuhn even didn't manage to publish his paper and had to write a whole new paper because he had issues of copyright with the original text which he recycled for this conference. So why do we bother to have a celebration of anniversary of a conference volume which is nothing more than a record of an event which has happened so long ago? Well, the Georgetown Conference, which happened in 1964, is somehow special. And the energy generated sent shockwaves to the sessions of the Second Vatican Council, where Dignitatis Humanae was going through the pipelines and was ultimately promulgated 5 months later. What is particularly significant about this conference and what it did was to generate an energy which is almost unique and unprecedented in the way public intellectuals, theologians, and lawyers thought and reflected about the relation between theology and rights, at least at this point in time. And I would argue later in this paper that they perhaps did it a lot better than many of us continue to do it today, and we'll try to reflect for the reasons why. So, in the first place, the conference indeed hosted a cast of stellar speakers. Some of those were parity at the Second Vatican Council, and they were not just any parities. They were the parities which essentially shaped the Augustinian takeover of the Council. In the case of Hans Kung and Karl Rahner, and essentially developed the Augustinian vision of the Church as communio and a pilgrim on a journey. And the consequences this had for the way theologians and religious voices began to speak and think about rights and freedom. Within this formidable Jesuit cohort, which shaped the agenda of the conference and ultimately shaped many of the agendas of the Second Vatican Council, was an odd character who didn't fit in the most obvious way in the program of the conference. A Lebanese diplomat, the first ambassador of Lebanon to the United Nations, who by the 60s was responsible for two of the most significant human rights projects in the context of the United Nations, the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, and for the most important ecumenical event of the 20th century. As a Lebanese ambassador to the United Nations, he shaped the personalist language of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights through the personalist vision of Chalcedonian Christology. As a leading ecumenist, he brokered the first meeting between Pope Paul VI and the ecumenical patriarch Athenagoras since the Great Schism in Jerusalem in January 1964, a meeting which broke the anathemas of 1054. And as if he didn't have enough on his plate, he decided to appear at the end of the same year at this infamous Georgetown conference, which 5 months later shaped the final finishing touches of the magisterium of Dignitatis Humanae. Malik is also the only non-Catholic Eastern Orthodox speaker at this event. In the texts which Malik proposed for this volume, The Metaphysics of Freedom, he offers a challenging existentialist premises of what does it mean to be human and what are the consequences of freedom which one has to claim as human person. Very much within the tradition of his philosophy professor, Heidegger, but also very much within a robust tradition of Eastern Orthodox references of the theology of the Council of Chalcedon. Away from group identities, existing freedom alone generates freedom. The natural right of man to freedom of thought, conscious belief, and expressions, such as it's proclaimed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is grounded in the metaphysical fact that man must be able to rebel and reject the truth to be free. Every human is sort of species unto himself. This is the meaning of one Christian doctrine, that he has an immortal soul, he has a distinctive name. Relating the idea of freedom in Malik is not an isolated event, and it has these much more complex circumstances. And in many ways, it sets the agenda of the presentations of many of the other speakers. All speakers at the conference offer a consolidated synthesis between the idea of freedom and Chalcedonian Christology. Some texts do that in a more effective fashion than others, but maintain the common thread through dogmatic theology, particularly in the cases of the texts by Hans Kung and Karl Rahner, through the linkages between freedom and the human person in the complex evolutionary theories of Pierre-Terre de Chardin, and through more social concerns such as the loss of sense of human person through group ideology, relationship between science and creativity, and so on and so forth. Some of those texts are not at the level, at the four key programmatic texts presented by John Courtney Murray, Malik, Kung, and Rana. But they nevertheless convey the very strong common current which these three essays present, as spelled out in a very powerful way by Runner in the final essay, Theology of Freedom. The history of salvation and revelation, which includes the history of Christian theology, is thus a history as well of man's philosophical examination of himself as a free being. For the history of revelation is also essentially the history of man's coming to his full heritage as man, and therefore it is the history of his freedom. There is a lot of that in going through and cutting through those essays, and makes this very strong case of relating a very robust concept of a human person with the grammar of freedom and rights, at least the way we appropriate it today, and in some way gives us additional insight into the strategies which authors like Malik deployed to build such a deep personalist sense of freedom in the drafting of documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This sense of freedom is seen as natural, pre-existing reality in the history of man, and it's beyond man's understanding, and therefore Christian voices and religious voices have responsibilities to protection and respect of human rights, because in some way, as religious voices, they're also custodians of this sense of freedom as embedded in nature of man. And of course, then the concern about culture and culture wars, challenges of the modern world, which then was not put in terms of cyber reality or artificial intelligence, challenges to democracy and freedom and resurgent authoritarianism are there, but they're not the central preoccupation of the authors. Their central preoccupation was why theological voices, religious voices should really take positions on those matters, and how not taking position on such matters would, in a way, deprive them from from their own authentic theological voices. In the center of this heroic effort in 1964, the conference speakers offered very different routes in terms of offering this consolidated effort to agree that as a starting point of any authentic notion of freedom in a political community, we have to have an authentic starting point, a strong Chalcedonian Christology. That because of this Christology, of the two natures of Christ, through baptism, we all become priests, prophets, and king, and acquire authority and freedom to act. And this ultimately became the Christology of churches, communio, and the Second Vatican Council, while crowning the final decrees of the Council. This is manifest in Hans Kung's appeal to go back to the origins through the authentic, energetic reorientation of the Word of God. The whole church wants to be taught the whole truth of the Spirit. Everyone belongs to the whole church. Everyone is called upon today's hour of decision of the church. Similar Christological starting points appear in Malik's paper, which goes even further and proposes the possibility of radical dialogical spaces, which we now describe as interreligious dialogue. Although, if Malik was alive today, he would probably be very disappointed in the hollow dimension of the interfaith projects and sheer triviality of their subjects. There was obviously something in the air of these conversations to take place in the first place in the middle of the excitement of the new energy generated by the Second Vatican Council, but it is also a testament of the great Jesuit tradition pushing the boundaries of the theological and political status quo, then and before. Did this conference make any difference at all in the ways we imagine rights and freedoms in theological contexts? Well, yes and no. On the one hand, it consolidated the energy and maintained the momentum which transformed Dignitatis Humanae from an idea to a positive reality. On the other hand, the synthesis between theology and legal and political concepts, such as rights and freedom, which were articulated in such a powerful and interesting way in the texts of the conference, was somehow lost in translation in the next few decades. There are circles within the Catholic Church which still remain awkward about Dignitatis Humanae, or indeed the very legacy of the Second Vatican Council. Very often, the discourses about rights in a Christian context are hijacked and carried on by modern natural law theories and theorists, pushing the discourse in the direction of clash of rights and cultural wars, rather than in the direction of a more robust and, quite frankly, more authentic and interesting synthesis between rights and dogmatics, which the Georgetown Conference actually achieved. Figures like Malik have been disowned for several decades by his own church, and he is virtually absent in the official efforts of various local Orthodox churches to engage with the ideas of freedom and human rights. Very little of this very robust Georgetown Conference synthesis is present in the documents produced by the delegations of the Holy See in the United Nations, or the series of texts published as pontifical documents which engage with questions of human rights. Do not get me wrong, they're very good, but somehow rather uneventful by comparison with some of the really brave and bold texts which this volume produced. These texts are not pietists. They are grounded on solid philosophy, classical dogmatic theology, and at least three of the texts represent the appropriation of the venerable existentialist and neo-Kantian philosophical traditions in the discourse. But they also represent traditions of churches which are not relegated to the spectator's seats in the theater of church and state relations. They're religious voices which can make difference and want to make difference urbi et orbi. The texts are also programmatic about the bridges between disciplines, theology and social sciences, theology and natural sciences, and so on and so forth. Have faith-based actors become more tactical and more technical in their engagement with modernity, and in the process they have lost the plot, what is actually at stake? This is certainly a reminder which the Georgetown Conference raises. Is it conceivable that they have accepted that they're simply in the spectators' seats and wish to merely endorse the policies of the states rather than bring them their own authentic voices and challenge or shape and reshape such policies? The Georgetown Conference reminds us that this is possible, but it also is a sober reminder that this doesn't happen anymore, and raises the big question why religious voices have really lost their nerve to engage in the way they were able to engage then. It also reminds us that it's what is meant for religious voices to be relevant in the past, but it is also what it takes to recast the message and find authentic voices today. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, ironically, is mentioned only once in the book. But the legacy of the work of the religious voices which participated and contributed to the drafting of the UDHR is very present in the grammar of the discourses in this text. In the same fashion Malik led the human rights revolution during the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights by convincing the drafting committee of the centrality of the robust idea of human person in the imagining of what human rights actually are. The overarching theme and the central intellectual strategies of the Georgetown Conference is the human person, not the church, not corporate freedoms, not minority rights, not societas perfecta, but the human person. And the agenda is reversed. We cannot have societas perfecta. We cannot have corporate freedoms. We cannot have even a church without an understanding, without an authentic understanding of freedom anchored through the authentic understanding of the human person. The texts of the conference do not tell us a lot about travaux préparatoires of the conference. And the Malik archive tells us very little about it either. It would be fascinating to explore further the extent to which the plotters at this conference actually met and talked how to put this together, and whether this synthesis of papers at the conference was accidental or it was carefully planned. Perhaps the John Courtney Murray archive would have some answers. It is not accidental that Malik is present as the only non-Catholic speaker, although he would have been considered very much part of the family, considering that he was married to a Christian Lebanese and baptized his son Habib in the Catholic Cathedral of Washington, D.C. I do consider these texts as a continuation of a trend which I described in my work as religious voices within the making of the modern human rights, a trend which human rights historiography, with very few exceptions, has tried to forget. The present text essentially illustrates a different and yet not dissimilar problem of a church, but also about churches which have reached a catastrophic disconnect from the tradition of religious voices and their attachment to the modern human rights discourse. They know that they have to engage with the question of rights, but have lost completely their ability to do so in theologically, or rather have reduced it in uneventful pietist theological apologetics. The Georgetown Conference reminds us that there are other and better ways, and they're not so distant or disconnected from the traditional theological disciplines. Among many other things, they guide religious voices in the direction of why and how we engage with rights talk rather than with the undeniable reality that we have no choice but to engage with the idea of rights. What I find particularly moving about the Georgetown event in 1964 is that it was driven by theological giants able to move mountains and transform intellectual spaces, religious and political discourses alike. This picture is in sharp contrast with today's interfaith scene, which I had the pleasure and pain exploring with my dear friend and colleague Catherine Marshall within and beyond the G20 process. The giants have been replaced by religious leaders as spectators who applaud and endorse policies of governments and do not change or even contribute in a meaningful way to the conversation. And when they have the occasional opportunity to move to the stage from their spectator seats, their contribution tends to be in the form of hugs and kisses and proposals for more conferences which could offer more hugs and kisses opportunities. The current state of play compared to the Georgetown Conference presents challenges and opportunities. It raises questions why religious voices have lost their voices, or at least their confidence to speak in an authentic and meaningful way. But it's also a reminder that a conference such as this one, which was possible in 1964, could possibly be an event which could happen in the future. The Georgetown Conference raises the bar and reminds us of an intellectual tradition and intellectual synthesis which was once our own, and there isn't any particular reason to not continue to be so, as long as we view it as a gift rather than the problem which we are desperately trying to overcome. Thank you very much